I'm taking you to a very different sort of world, which I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with. I'll be talking of a time in India starting from around 1995 to about 2010 or 12, when we made a major shift in how we worked in school education with textbooks. We still are a low resource environment, but at that time it was even worse. So this is my theme. What did we learn about developing high quality books that are affordable in low resource environments? I'll start with a background on the Indian school education system. I assume we are the largest system at the moment with 1.48 million schools. We have 9.5 million teachers and 26.5 to 265.2 million students from pre-primary to higher secondary level. All of these schools, there are actually many subcategories, but there are two major categories. There are government-run schools and there are privately managed schools. What I'm talking about is more related to the government-run schools. The pupil-teacher ratio in 90s used to be above 40, but is now much better. India has 28 states, 8 union territories. We have an apex body, the National Council for Educational Research and Training. It develops a national curriculum framework. Now, it's important to note that there is no national curriculum. We have a national curriculum framework because under our constitution, all states are autonomous and they may make their own, but following a broad framework. So therefore, our national curriculum framework sets out a broad learning objective for each stage of education. And they also develop textbooks. States are again free to use those, adapt them, or to make their own, which many states do. Each state has its own education board and also its own State Council of Education Research and Training. These develop their curriculum, textbooks, and conduct the exams for that state. You have obviously always heard that India is the land of diversities, and language is one big issue of diversity. In the 1990s, we had over 1,200 languages. We now have around 800. 22 are official languages, and there are many other home languages. Education is in schools, it happens mainly in the regional language, that is to say the language which is the most prevalent in a state. English is also taught, and students may learn other languages. All of this has implications for textbooks. I was quite relating with the points that Christian was raising about the language and debates around it. Now, since states have children from many languages, including from neighboring states, they develop textbooks not just in the main language of the state, but also for neighboring states, sometimes for indigenous groups. Some states may develop books in 16 languages. 3 to 8 is quite common. For this entire implementation of educational processes as well as textbook development, the central government sets a policy framework. It funds national initiatives, but it is the state governments who actually do the work. They may make policies for their own states. They manage their schools, they develop their curriculum, they train their teachers. So there you can say there have been waves of textbook development in India, and they often take place because of some major national policy event or a change. Sometimes it happens at the state level when there's a change in the state governments. But around 1995, India launched major EFA, Education for All projects, with major funding from the government itself, Government of India, as well as from World Bank, European Commission, DFID. and others. And that led to many changes, which I'll be describing. In 2005, we also made a major shift by developing a national curriculum framework, which again triggered changes. And now, most recently, in 2023, we have created the National Curriculum Framework for School Education, which is going to roll out from this year onwards. So I'll be talking of the impact of the EFA initiatives and the NCF 2005. Now, this is where we were in late 1990s when the EFA efforts began. We had very low enrollment rates. We had about 40% children in school, but in about 10 years, we had close to 99, 98, 99% children in school. We had a massive school construction program. We had a very low quality of education for various reasons. And of course, a lack of equity. It was absolutely certain that if you were from a family that was not well off, you were not going to learn much. A very low resource environment. This is a slightly complicated statement in the sense that the schools often had very little paper, not too many notebooks, and very few books, very few teaching learning materials, if any, sometimes. But the nature around schools in many places was full of things you could learn from. So it was very low resource in the sense of a resource that is designed and provided, but it was a high resource in terms of if you could spot it and use it, it was all around you. So the government at this time initiated these EFA programs called District Primary Education Program, which later evolved into SSA, Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, in 2000. And the intention was to provide free and compulsory education to children aged 6 to 14. In 2009, we passed the Right to Education Act, and then the process has continued. Now, one significant fallout, which has a bearing on everything, including on textbooks, is that this rapid expansion of access from 40% children having access to nearly 99, 100%, was that earlier we had only what I would call a diversity in our classroom. Because even the children who came mainly came from backgrounds where they could attend school. But as we shifted and made access open to all, and we implemented drives to ensure all children were coming into school, we started getting into our classrooms children who typically never attended school. Children who are working children, migrant groups, girls from certain communities, a lot of tribal children, children with disabilities. There's a long range list of categories. I would say that much of the increase from 40 to 60% was made of children who often did not attend school. What this meant is that there was a shift in the profile of the students. And one continuing problem has been that we have continued to keep in mind the student profile that used to be there when 40% children were in school and not adapted enough to this diversity. There was and still is a very high prevalence of multi-grade teaching for a variety of reasons, especially administrative and political ones. It's difficult to ensure that all teachers are appointed, all teachers attend every day. And I would say again that about 60 to 70% teachers, especially in grades 1 to 5, may be found teaching at least more than one class, sometimes 3 classes. There's a wide prevalence even of single teacher schools even now. So all of this is the background in which we started the process. So it was at this time that I was Chief Consultant to the Government of India for curriculum and textbook development, working in 18 states. Subsequently, I worked independently, and I'll be sharing with you a reflection on that experience, mainly focused on grades 1 to 5, though I've worked in other grades in high school, but those issues are very different, so I'll keep it limited to this. So the situation of textbooks when we started, can say this is like the baseline. And it's very interesting. Some of the points are mentioned in the PhD students' work as well, that textbooks were the only or the main source of classroom learning. In fact, they were sacred, unquestionable. They were also the only reading material, though obviously even in India that has changed now with so much access to digital content. But their sacredness is not. They were unquestionable. The main view was that if you had internalized the textbook, if you could reproduce it, you had learned it. The second, I think, is a very big issue, which does not get talked about much. Textbooks were developed by people who were considered important in educational terms. They were experts. They could be people from universities, from institutions, from certain organizations. I coined a term for them. I call them fathers of education. They were fathers mainly because there were not very many mothers at the time that we began. And it seems to me that the whole point of these fathers of education was to uphold the inequalities that our society had fallen into, where certain groups' interests gained advantage over all others. Textbooks were developed by committees who would take a call on things. Individual writers would be given tasks. Review committees would look at it. Editing was considered mainly the same as proofreading. And many states who could not get enough experts would adopt the NCERT books. With the situation that, for example, in a state like Himachal Pradesh, which is in the Himalayas, the very first lesson is about a railway engine. And that area has no railway engines because in the Himalayas, you don't have trains. But because they had adopted the NCERT book, that is why it was there. Pretty much things were run by these experts, and there were no agreed upon guidelines or specifications or style sheets. Different writers may work for the same class, but their books may not be talking to each other. So cross-curricular linkages would not be there. The main point in the textbooks was essentially that the authors would kind of show their scholarliness and the curriculum's priorities, but what was really child-friendly. The whole point was to mold children, to guide them, to fit them into what was desired interest, instead of trying to understand them, their world, their interests, or what is it that would make the books accessible to them. Another important point was that the book was made and it was up to the teacher to just manage to somehow teach it. But what if the classroom situation did not lend itself to that? What if children did not speak the language of the textbook, which most children did not? What if children could not attend every day, which children being poor, a large proportion of them could not? There was not enough, for example, scope for revision. There was no concept of field testing, trialing, or feedback for the material. And in fact, teachers never looked at the curriculum document or even the syllabus that came from that curriculum. They taught only the textbook. It was a didactic approach, and it's something I'm sure all of you know. And the standard pattern was that at the end of every lesson, there were questions, evaluation as it was called. It was focused on recall. And once a new textbook came out, it was assumed that teachers would be able to teach it. Even if any changes had been made, there was no need to guide them. And teachers' guides, when they were made, but they were very, full of general pontificatory advice, talking down to teachers, generally saying, teach well, and not giving very specific guidance on what to do. Design and illustration was not really considered important. Some states, in fact, did not have illustrators at all. Science teachers were involved in making science illustrations, and we had a lot of grotesque illustrations. Production personnel were not involved in development phases. So this was a very big issue because since production guidelines were not agreed upon, or limitations were not agreed upon, the writers would write any length of material, and then these books would not be producible. And then a lot of time would be spent in rewriting, chopping, cutting it down, or they would be expensive. Sometimes there would be no link between the illustrations and the text. Different books, page sizes and numbers would vary, and so on. And interestingly, though I'm talking of 1995, many states were still using letterpress and had not shifted even to offset or web press. And though DTP systems were widely available and cheap, but they were not being used in government textbook production. A big pain point for all of us was that books often reached months after the school session started. And this was at a time when children still bought books. As a result of the processes that I'm describing, a few years later, India was able to give books free to children and make big shift in reaching on time. So for all the people who were involved in thinking about what to do, the big questions were that it was clear that the pedagogy that was expected in our schools was very different. This is we had a national policy on education in 1986, which quite clearly spelled out that children will learn through activity, exploration, and projects. There would be a warm and welcoming atmosphere in the classroom, and of course, it went in detail into that. So pedagogy was expected to be very different, not only in general, but also for specific subjects. But the textbooks didn't lend themselves to this. And the very big issue was that how would you visualize what these books would be like? If you hadn't even seen a different kind of textbooks, how would you make one? How would you agree to what kind of books you should have? In his presentation, Christian talked about debates. I'm using the word contestation. Because of the manner in which our books were produced, many of their aspects were highly contested. They were politically contested, culturally contested, educationally contested, and very often books would be withdrawn, would have to be rewritten. Early experience showed that this needed to be worked upon, and there were many reasons for this kind of contestation. Big issue, of course, was that all the key underlying underpinnings or under principles on which the books were based were not documented, shared, and agreed upon. For example, whose knowledge, whose language, whose worldview would the books reflect? The issue of language, of course. Since, as you've seen, the print runs would be very large in certain cases. So corruption played a very big role, and who would print and distribute became a big issue. Religion, though we are, by our constitution, we are a secular country, but there's always this aspect of trying to push in one religion at the cost of others. Who would make these books? Is it the experts? Is it those higher up in the social hierarchy? Should it be ordinary people who are involved but capable of making books? Should teachers be involved? This was a very big debate. The experts held that, would you expect the CEO of a company to ask a watchman in his company to be involved in decisions? So we dealt with this kind of idea that teachers were lowest down in the hierarchies. And should they be selected? What should be the roles of different roles involved in developing textbooks? What capabilities are required? What would be the interests of the various institutions? Then, when you know the book, the problem with making books is that if you have invested a lot of money in making 1 million books, and then you find they don't work, it's a lot of money and a lot of trees and forests down the drain. So how would you know before you made them that they actually do work? And can you produce them inexpensively? Can you reach them to schools in a cost-effective, time-effective manner? And once they do reach schools, will they be used? And if they're used, will they lead to improved learning? So as you can see, there's a range of huge issues that confronted the country. To address these, we organized a series of national workshops where we invited important decision makers, representatives of different sections of society, teachers, many others, to formulate an understanding on the direction that textbook development should take. And that participatory approach, I think, really helped. Here I was really conflicted. I had thought of giving you details, stories, and pictures of all the books and everything, but that will require 3 or 4 hours. So I will be talking really more about what we learned. I'm just referring to some of the, I'm just listed some of the states whose examples that I am going to talk about. The process is based not just in what happened in one state, but in several states. UP, Uttar Pradesh, for example, has over 100,000 schools. This is a small state, Nagaland, and it has only 7,000 schools. Several others. So I'll skip this slide, but I'll go to the process that emerged. Now, early experience showed that if you wanted to work through the state boards, the state councils of education, research, and training, you would not get a lot of response. They were understaffed, they were unwilling. Now, this also happened under the mechanism of the EFA effort, wherein a separate society was created to receive funds, to manage them, and was given academic and administrative authority. And the institutions were not very happy with that. And the problem in the EFA funding was that if you did not deliver the output within time, the money would lapse. And next year you wouldn't get it. So this was a very big issue, especially in the first 1 or 2 years. While textbooks were part of the process, there were several things happening under the overall systemic reform process, curriculum development, in-service teacher training, so on, institutional renewal, many, many things. And what quickly emerged was that if you had one kind of curriculum, but a different kind of textbook, which could happen, because you started making the textbook and then also started the curriculum process, and it did not get enough time to incorporate that into the textbook that came out. Or you had the same old kind of evaluation, assessment evaluation system as before, or you were not able to incorporate this in the in-service training because the in-service training department was not talking with the curriculum and textbook department. Then in the field, you just got multiple messages and a lot of mess. You needed a way of taking a kind of ecosystem approach where there was an organic link between all the different things that were happening. As I mentioned before, when textbooks were made, all the thinking behind them was not documented, not shared, and not agreed upon. And since there was not enough sign-off, later any group would come out and say, this is not okay. So a new mechanism was needed because we now could not get sufficient and rapid output from our state institutions. So from policy perspective, administrative perspective, delivery perspective, an idea was brought about of creating what are called state resource groups. This was a game changer for us because These were like task forces. They were drawn from the best people within the system. They could be teachers, trainers, teacher educators, NGO members, those from within the institutions. They were designed to be selected very carefully to represent all the geographies of the state, the genders, groups, etc. And I have to mention that these 15 years are remarkable in India, mainly because of the kind of energy and enthusiasm they generated. Very important role was played by some champions in the bureaucracy. We have the Indian Administrative Service, so some critical officials led the process, working long hours in the field and everywhere with teachers, with everyone, to overcome institutional inertia, resistance, but also to motivate people. So many of these efforts on renewing textbooks, in fact, that's the term, they were not, textbooks were not called, it was not called revision, it was called renewal of textbooks. They were located in EFA program offices and not in institutions. So the first task in this whole process was to identify who should be involved. In every state, there would be several hundred people who would have to work in books for all the subjects in, say, grades 1 to 8. So the idea was mooted and then implemented that there should be a selection test. The reason was that it was found that when people are nominated, let's say a ground level official says this person would be good, the nominated person is always so grateful for that opportunity that they actually are willing to bend backwards and listen to whatever is said. Whereas when a person has proved their own mettle by taking part in a selection test, they would not accept anything and they would argue, and that was considered very healthy. So a selection profile was developed of who should be included or for the kind of people to be involved. It was a complex exercise, but one of the more successful parts of this work. And the selection test involved a written part, but also a kind of workshop mode, wherein you had to conduct an activity, give a response publicly to a lesson or critique something, and also give a feedback, which included also suggesting improvements that a person should make from your own team publicly. And also, so each person was observed and marked on a range of indicators to know if they could do what was required, which was whether they understood children, understood teaching learning processes, understood the context, the subject. They had the ability to learn how to create material, including all the genres, the exercises, and whether they could work in a group. Interestingly, in many states, the experts also participated, and most of them did not make through. This had consequences because it created gaps, issues, and I have to also mention that the history of educational reform efforts is a history of conflicts. And that's another theme by itself of how conflict in systems can be productive and can also be not so. However, there were several states where experts also within the institutions agreed. For example, in Tamil Nadu, the SEART realized that they had missed out on something and they decided they would participate. And school placement became an interesting way for them to come up to the required level to participate in the process. They would be placed for a month in a school in a remote area with very little resources, and everyone around instructed not to help them. They would have to teach children, and they would have to do with children what they wanted to ask teachers to do. It was a transformative experience for every person who was involved. And without it, in fact, actually, you can't really do this work. So the whole process identified writers, editors. Editors came from writers mainly, but also translators, illustrators, designers, and DTP personnel. For them, different kinds of things were done to select. And they were not all identified in the beginning. They were identified later, and they were also oriented differently by different groups of people. This was a logistical exercise as well in many states where equipment, for example, 300 people had to work in a building from basement to the 7th floor. So you needed space, resource materials, libraries, funds, and a substantial investment of time and effort. And I think that's one place where EFA funds have been best utilized in India. And this remains a period of unmatched enthusiasm and energy in the Indian education system. One of the biggest innovations, I would say, was to create a very long pre-writing phase. That is to say, it was a few months before all those people involved were allowed to write a single lesson. But when they wrote very fast, very quickly, and in a very assured manner. The whole point was to prepare them to do their best, but also to document and agree upon all the things so that there would not be this contestation later, and to create a documented base of this in the form of base papers and implication papers. So the process would begin by all 300 people or 250 people or whatever number being facilitated in a participatory experiential workshop, which was quite exciting and emotionally rich, wherein you would visualize, you would go through a process of envisaging what kind of teaching learning process you want in the class. What do children do when they play, and does that come into the class? The facilitator would conduct an activity and participants would respond to it, and then there would be discussion on whether this connects with learning, with textbooks. An interesting part of this exercise was often that on the second day of this workshop, if lunch was at 1:30, a barrage of activities would be initiated around 1:15. And at around 2:30, people would be reminded, hey, you forgot to have lunch, what happened? And it was this experience that learning can be so different from what we have thought of till now. And that's what we want to see in our schools. And that's the kind of result our textbook should create. That created the kind of commitment in people. And eventually, people would create vision documents, which would talk, they would also talk about not only what we want to see, but what are the difficulties, issues children face, teachers face, what are the changes needed, what are the changes needed, not only in the textbooks, but in assessment, in training, in the way we organize our classroom, in the way we use our environment. And all of this would be documented, and there would be vision statements, which would say that if you go to a school that we have created in 3 years' time, this is what you will see, this is what you will hear, this is you will find the teacher doing or the students doing. So the point was to make an emotional connect. After this workshop, participants would go back. Most of them were teachers. They would try out many of these things in their own classroom. So they would bring back that experience to the next workshop, wherein now the underpinnings would be discussed seriously. The sequence that I'm describing to you, again, it was arrived at after a lot of experience and mistakes, but it follows basically the andragogy of starting with experience and then moving towards more abstract understanding. We would discuss what are the beliefs and assumptions on which our work is based, whether it is in pedagogy or materials. And this was in 4 or 5 areas. What do you believe about children? For example, is a child an empty pot to be filled up? Is a child wet clay to be molded? Is a child a seed to be nurtured? Or is a child something else? A person who believes a child is an empty pot to be filled up cannot make the same kind of textbook as a person who believes that a child is like a seed to be nurtured or something else. Are children naughty always? Do they have to be kept in discipline? What does it mean for your pedagogy and textbook? There was a series of questions like this. Similarly, what are your beliefs and assumptions about teachers? What is the role of the teacher? In our context, a very tough question to answer was, is a teacher a villain or a victim? What exactly is learning like? How does it happen? What is the role of memorization in learning, for example? What about equity? Is it true that all children can learn? And what really is education for? So there were beliefs and assumptions, and very interestingly, these were heated debates conducted in a facilitated manner. Areas of agreement were documented, areas of disagreement were documented, worked upon further. But more importantly, the implications of each of those was discussed for what textbooks and for everything else. Next came the whole issue of approaches to knowledge and to the subjects. So when you teach language, for example, do you teach only pronunciation and diction, or do you also want children to be able to raise their voice when it matters, about injustice, for example? What is knowledge and whose knowledge is knowledge? In today's time frame, a similar question would be, if I can look up a lot of information on a mobile phone, then what is knowledge? So again, these would be thrashed out. Each of these would be 6-day, 5-day event with a lot of documentation, with implications written for the kind of books we wanted. During this entire process, as part of the variety of this whole thing, we also took teachers, participants on what I will call a conducted tour of best children's materials, especially from Europe. We contacted the embassies of your countries here, and 33 embassies gave us award-winning books from your countries for children, especially young children. And as I mentioned to you, how can you make a different book if you have never seen one? It's very difficult to visualize without that kind of trigger. So we use that, and that was a remarkably helpful step. We now, all of us, the 300 people involved in a state, and this happened in multiple states, maybe 15. We had a common language, a common framework, a common way of looking at it, and then we started looking at our existing textbooks. So what would need to change in the textbook? So the point is, if any change was made, that also was documented. And so it was a process of this kind that I am calling a pre-writing phase, which prepared the ground for us to begin on writing the textbooks. Keeping in mind that production, that is printing, procurement of paper and printing, was something that led to a lot of delays. We would also initiate a review of several states had their own textbook presses, or they had a system of recruiting printers. The state of UP, for example, would work with 300 printers. So all of those processes were reviewed to see if we involved the National Book Trust in doing this. So base papers were agreed upon, and they would often go to the government or others, and they would be signed off. Throughout this whole process that I'm describing, I won't go into this in detail, but a critical part was there were so many different tasks. And in fact, we had to create a textbook management information system, TMIS, to do this. Teams would keep evolving, changing at different times. Now, the implications of all of these were also worked out for textbook. As I mentioned to you, for example, if the discussion was, what are the difficulties that children face? One of the difficulties was that they could not attend every day. Now, you cannot compel them to come to school. So what do you need to do? So for example, one big shift was to shift from a linear kind of textbook to a more spiral kind of approach, where you reiterated certain things time and again. So many of these things went into eventually what became a set of guidelines for developing the textbooks. So all this background discussion was used to create guidelines, checklists, specifications. For example, if you ask children to write in a book, I'm mentioning this because it was felt a textbook worked better when children could write in it. What should be the height of the handwriting of children that you aim for, so that you provide the right kind of space? So it was very detailed. The textbook writer's guidelines were the most detailed. At the time, two big issues for us were in younger classes, especially grades 1, 2, and 3, the integration, the connection between different subjects, and ensuring that local knowledge could come in a big way. But also, what kind of stories do children like? What kinds of poems? How do you write instructions? How do you sequence the material? If there are 5 stories, how do you decide within one grade how to sequence them? Those would be about 40 pages just for the writers, then later for editing, translation, etc., etc. Frameworks, drafts, and so there were guidelines for each stage that came out of this process. Now, before we wrote the books, the production specifications were agreed upon, and paper procurement process was begun. The state of Kerala needed 120 truckloads of paper. So, in government bureaucratic systems, that's not so easy to get very quickly. That's the kind of process that would be begun. Then after a few months came the writing and production phase. So again, before you actually wrote, the idea was, I want to emphasize that, many times writers initially would think that writing is a kind of mainly creative, free-flowing effort. But no, it is a purposive, specific, need-based process. You have to do exactly what is required and not other things. It's not something where you can just go off in any tangent that you like. That does not mean that what we create will not be innovative, will not be creative. Yes, it will be. But it does not allow you to wander around and use the time, because, as I mentioned, at the end of all the processes that we did were children. Interestingly, in many states, because India was a country which had experienced extreme poverty for a very large proportion of our children, and we needed foreign funds to initiate this process. Our workshops would often begin by asking participants to calculate how much that workshop was costing us. And the conclusion would be arrived that every minute was equal to textbooks for 20 children. And the understanding was that if you waste a minute, that's what you're losing. So we needed a well-guided process that allowed for that creativity while preventing just wandering around. So in the writing phase, participants will be oriented on how to convert curriculum into a learning flow over the year for that subject, for that grade, how they would connect different subjects. Once you had that, this is what must be transacted over the year. Everything you have in that list is not what is going to be in the books that children have. Much of that would be materials for teachers rather than for children. If you load children's books with what you also want teachers to have, then you are increasing the bulk of the book, increasing the cost of the book, and you're reducing the space for children. So this saved us a lot of material, because we started then creating teachers' editions. Teachers' editions were different from teachers' guides. Teachers' guides were more general flowing kind of documents, but teachers' editions were the same page as the children's book, but just reduced. A lot of experimentation was done to see how far it could be reduced, to the point that the teacher could see it without a problem, and then have all information for that page around it. And that was really helpful, because the teacher needed only one book, and that material was not required in children's books. So it was a huge fund saver. The next part of it was that once this is what goes into children's books, that you need to frame it. So you already knew you had 96 pages or 80 pages. So the number of pages was again fixed beforehand, keeping in mind various factors, but also reducing waste. And you also knew by experience, trying things out, roughly what the length of a lesson would be. So you knew that you would get 20 lessons, 12 lessons, 15 lessons. And then you would distribute the curriculum in those, keeping in mind that reiteration that I mentioned. You would distribute the genres, the exercises, the gradations. From this would come detailed outlines for lessons, which specified very clearly, this is, in this lesson, a story of this kind in exactly so many words. So a lot of research was done, and existing research was used to understand text-to-picture ratio for different age groups, and find out what kind of illustrations, what proportion of illustrations, what font sizes. A very interesting finding for us was that in fonts in Indian languages other than English, the leading or the gap between the lines, when reduced, allowed you when increased, allowed you to reduce the font size and include more text without decreasing legibility and readability. So a lot of this kind of work was done. Am I running out of time, Andy?
Subir, you're doing. It's fantastic listening to you, but I'm worried that we're running out of time for others to ask the questions they want to ask.
All right, I'll wind up in 5 minutes. Okay.
So can you wrap?
Sorry, say again.
Can you wrap up in 1 minute or?
All right, I'll do that. So I'll be sharing this PPT, and this is how our books were developed. An important part was that an implementation plan was also created for them. We found that increasing the development cost by 2% leads to around 36% reduction in printing cost. And that led to allowing us to provide books for free. Children who typically were not represented started coming into our books. An interesting feedback we had was that many teachers would say that when it rained, children would go home with the books on the top of their head, but now they hug them and try to prevent that from getting wet. And some of the states, especially Kerala, which was ranked around 30 in India, made a huge shift and has been in the top 3 ever since. We've learned a lot of things, and we now are moving into another stage. But I want to say here that the lessons of that era are lost in the last 10 years. The fathers of education are back. The experts and the empire have sort of struck back. System memory is now no more doing this kind of work. There has been improvement. There's also been sort of slide back. So 25 years ago, we were asking this question, how do children learn? And about 15 years ago, we started asking, how do teachers learn? And this is the question we are asking now. How does an education system learn? Thank you so much.